Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to the APCG online colloquium. We are going to be discussing Réginas Ndayiragije, did I say that right? A paper about power sharing in Burundi. We have two great discussants, Tim Longman and Alex Kruger. And so the way that it will be structured is Réginas will give us about a 5-minute overview or kind of direction as to what kind of feedback he would like to receive. And then we will have comments from Timothy and Alex, and then we'll open it up to questions for the rest of the group. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'll pass the microphone to Réginas.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Thank you for organizing this this colloquium. I know all the work that it requires to have this organized, so thank you so much. And thank you for Alex and Timothy for having accepted to be my discussant, and also thank you all for having showed up. It's really good to see that my paper triggered some interest for you, and I'm very happy to see some of the scholars that they've been reading, and it's really impressive. So yeah, if I would say some few words concerning my paper is, as you know, Burundi has been implementing a constitutional power sharing, which is an ethnic power sharing. And it was adopted since August 2000. And the intention was to end an ongoing bloody conflict in Burundi. So that's how the power sharing got adopted, because the theory of change that is behind is, if all the ethnicities are included in the governance of the country, then we would have a chance of mitigating recurrent conflicts that the country has been experiencing for years. That's how it got accepted. But as you can see it, there is a minority overrepresentation, because Tutsi, who demographically represent 15%, they are represented by 40% in most of state institutions. That actually reflects the power balance that was there in 2000 when it got adopted. So my inquiry was, how does the power sharing as such adapt to the fluctuating reality of political context? That is my research question. And I suspected that maybe the ethnic majority would grab the most salient ministerial portfolio, because I think I don't have to discuss why high salience ministerial portfolio matters in the context of African politics. That was my first suspicion. And my second one was that maybe the ethnic majority would try to grab most of portfolios in positions where ethnic quota are not required. That's what I suspected. And then to know what is a high salience ministerial portfolio is in the context of Burundi, I conducted an expert survey where I contacted people who have an intimate knowledge of Burundian politics, notably former ministers, head of key parties, former vice presidents, etc., and some political analysts, just two of them. And then they were requested to give a value to each ministerial portfolio, a value which ranged from 1 to 5, depending on whether the ministerial portfolio is considered as salient or not. That's how I did it. And then I compared the power allocation for each ethnic group, and compared with the prescribed quota, and see if there is a link or not. So what I realized when I was trying to make sense of the data that I have, it was that, first of all, there is a shift in the objective of the initial objective of power sharing. Well, it used to be a strategy to make institutions more inclusive. it has become over time a strategy of regime survival, for instance. That's the first finding. The second is that maybe ethnicity is no longer the only game in the city, because now you can see that there is regionalism that is involved, there is patronage and a coup-proofing strategy, as I said. So, but on the other hand, I see that also ethnicity continues to play an important role in Burundian politics. So that's what I can say in terms of background, because I think my 5 minutes are done now. The kind of input and comments and contributions that I am expecting from you guys is any kind of input that you can have, where you can see that my paper can be improved. It's an early draft, so I won't be hard to have any kind of feedback. So thank you so much again for showing up, and I am looking forward to this conversation and input that you would be willing to give me. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks for that overview. So I'll start with Tim because he's next on my screen
Sure.
For feedback.
Sure, thanks for, it's an interesting paper, and I think Burundi is insufficiently studied. As somebody who's done Rwanda and Burundi, I get all these people who say, I want to go to Rwanda. I'm like, no, go to Burundi. No one studies Burundi. So I already think you're doing something that is needed. And also the power sharing agreement in Burundi has received far too little attention. It's interesting. It's kind of unique on the continent. And it's such an interesting contrast with Rwanda's denial of ethnicity that I think, I think it's definitely worth talking about. That said, I actually think you'd be better with this paper, and this, I know this is an APCG panel, but not making it an African studies paper. Because most of the cases of consociationalism are outside of Africa. And I think that you want to address that literature more than the African studies literature, because you're really trying to make a comment about consociationalism. But those cases, are Bosnia and Lebanon and Northern Ireland. They're not other African cases. And so I think where you frame this in terms of African studies, I actually think that's not to your advantage. And I think what you want to say is that you're thinking about consociationalism and the lessons that Burundi offers that. It's the one African case where this is really true. And that said, you need a stronger argument. I think you've got an interesting empirical information and a lot of good data that you've gathered and all that, and you're playing very close to your chest. You're sort of stopping with the empirics. And I think what you want to do is then come back and say, okay, what does this tell us, not about Burundi, but about consociationalism? What do we learn about it here? Because I think you want to push the implications of this. All right. So if people buy this issue that consociationalism focuses on ethnic distribution, but doesn't get down to the fine points as you're talking about, and so some ministries are more important than others, so there's not really equitable sharing of power. Okay, what does that tell us then about consociationalism in general? Because I think that's what the contribution of this paper will ultimately be. That said, I also think you need a little more discussion of the Burundian context. So you touch on the issue of regional distribution. And of course, in Burundian politics, region is really important. You mentioned just in passing that Bururi has been the center of power. Well, it was the center of power from Michombero to Buyoya, but before that, of course, Gitega was the center of power, and so now we've had this shift back, and then Agathon Rwasa, is from the north, but most of his supporters come from the south, and there's all these regional dynamics that the consociationalism doesn't take into account at all, and that note is important nevertheless. And so I think that it would be interesting to think about, okay, what is it that consociationalism does touch on ethnicity, and what does it fail to cover that's still important in the Burundian case, which is your province of origin? and these sort of historic cases of where power lies. I was a little surprised, yeah, that you kind of didn't talk about the FNL at all, and because I think that rivalry between the CNDD-FDD and the FNL, which for at least the past two elections has really motivated politics, I would guess that it must shape how they distribute ministries in some way. And so I think at least some mention of that would be useful. And then my final point is for you to assess the importance of what you're talking about a little bit more, which is to say, my impression has been that on the whole, the power sharing in Burundi has done an okay job of diffusing ethnic tensions. Hasn't eliminated them, but compared to what Burundi was like prior to this, where ethnicity was highly salient and very polarized, my impression is that the primary political divisions in Burundi today are not ethnic. They're still there, they still matter, but that divide between supporters of Rwasa and supporters of the CNDD-FDD seems to be more important, and that's among Hutu. And of course, it's not that ethnicity is gone, but it seems like it seems that at some level this has worked. And so the question I want you to get at a little bit is what you're talking about something that's undermining that ultimately? Do you think that because they haven't really taken into account the real power of the ministries, that's ultimately going to help bring ethnicity back as a more salient feature? Because I think that's ultimately the concern. If not, well, then you need to sort of deal with that. If you think this is an issue, but it's not a huge issue, okay, well, lay that out. But the question is sort of assessing what has the power sharing accomplished. And then I guess, okay, so one more final thing, which is when we talk about consociationalism, it's usually thought of as an agreement among elites, right? But it's an agreement among elites that's supposed to have an impact at the grassroots. And I want to get a little more sense of that for you. So you've got this elite agreement. Does that make a difference at the grassroots? Is that affecting how people in Burundi identify themselves and connect to the government? All right, I'll stop there.
Great. So why don't we collect both discussant comments, and then Réginas, you can reply if you want to both of them. So I'll turn it over to Alex.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of my comments are quite similar to what Timothy is bringing up. As someone that is not an expert on Burundi, but is interested in cabinets and power sharing within cabinets, I think this paper makes a lot of really important empirical contributions as is. When I read about the elite survey about portfolio salience, like my eyes got big and I was like, wow, this is great. Because we have several data sets that code prestige of portfolios, but nobody does the elite survey to actually ask elites what positions they want. And while it may be kind of a small thing to people that don't study cabinets, I was really excited about your finding about the Ministry of Education being a high salience portfolio. It's typically coded as kind of a medium prestige position, but your explanation of why it's seen as high salience in Burundi makes complete sense, and will definitely kind of have me rethink my use of prestige coding from other data sets. You can emphasize the data a bit more as well, because it is a big improvement on the existing data we have, particularly on cabinets. If you look at sources like WhoGov, they don't have information on ethnicity or region. Data sets on power sharing, like ethnic power relations, they're okay, but they're very broad, and they're not really identifying the identities of individuals on a very specific level. The African Cabinet and Political Elite data, which has recently come out, has information on ethnicity, but you have a bit more than ECPED, in that you also have information on these provincial governors. So you make a lot of empirical contributions that you can definitely emphasize a lot more in the paper. I think as Timothy was pointing out, one of the biggest places you can improve the paper is by developing a theory. The theoretical sections that you have, they're too focused on other people's work. And you have a good argument, you have interesting findings, but it just gets a bit lost in your discussions of the work of other scholars. And I think if you can kind of bring your questions and your argument to the forefront, that's really going to help make this paper a lot better. In terms of the theory, you discuss a lot of factors that are theoretically important to sustaining power sharing, or the type of power sharing that occurs, like, you know, the power of the ruling party relative to other parties or other actors. You mentioned the importance of the military within that power sharing arrangement and the demographics of the military. You know, you mentioned social demographics, or societal demographics, excuse me. Develop all of that stuff in that second section, and do it a little bit more clearly, because right now you have these interesting bits of information kind of throughout the paper, but having all of that right up front will allow readers that maybe aren't as interested in the Burundi case to follow along and to really understand how this paper contributes to studying power sharing in other contexts. The other thing to include in the theory, definitely discuss the critical junctures part. This is something that, you know, similar studies, say from Rossler and Oles, they're not really talking about these critical junctures and how power dynamics change over time. Your study really does that. So you can kind of theoretically distinguish your approach, I think, by emphasizing those critical junctures generally up front, and then developing the specific critical junctures in Burundi a bit more in the case study. I think once you develop those general theoretical ideas a little bit better, it's going to make it easier to revise that case study so it's really focusing specifically on your questions. It includes a lot of great information right now, but without that theoretical guidance, it's not entirely clear what information is most important. And what is most important for your argument doesn't stand out as much as it should. So yeah, and within that case study, before you get to looking at the data, I would spend more time talking about the changing power dynamics across the different presidential administrations, so that, you know, once you get to the data, the reader's already a little bit primed into what the theoretical expectations might be for how this power sharing evolved. Yeah, so some other things, a little bit of discussion on, a little bit more discussion on the salience of portfolios would be helpful. So, you know, having a high salience portfolio doesn't necessarily mean that the minister has a lot of power and influence within the government. So I think particularly if you could address the issue of whether non-co-ethnics of the leader that are in those high salience positions actually have the power and influence we might expect in a high salience position, that would help. And I think you can also kind of use your data a little bit more to discuss maybe how changes in cabinet size might influence these power sharing dynamics, or even, you know, looking at things like minister dismissals across, you know, ethnic groups, or minister defections across ethnic groups, just to kind of get a little bit more out of your data to analyze how power sharing has evolved. So yeah, those are my main comments.
Great, thank you. So Réginas, do you want to respond to those comments?
Yeah, no, thank you very much again, Timothy and Alex for your insights and advice on how I can improve the paper. I actually received written feedback from Alex. I thank you again. Thank you again because
I have mine. I'll send it to you.
oh, that's great.
No
Thank you. Yeah. No. Now I think I will make just two small comments on what Timothy said. First of all, he was asking how what I'm studying is really relevant in the contemporary Burundi. Actually, where I think fragmentation lines are no longer only ethnic, but I think one can have the impression that maybe ethnicity is no longer salient, but it is, because I think if political exclusion has in the past generated conflicts and armed conflicts, it can happen again, and that's the fear that everyone has, and that's why I think in a context where the country doesn't have this kind of mechanisms where, for instance, access to state services and other facilities is not well codified and well organized. I think it's where it may have not to be represented in certain institutions, and that's why I think it's important. Second, I think Timothy asked if power sharing is an elite deal, how it resonates with the populace on the grassroots level. And I think it's what I'm studying in my PhD also, because I'm interested in how perceptions of political representation evolve over time because of this power sharing deal. So it's something that I will do in other chapters and other papers. So it's something that is important for me also. So thank you very much for confirming that what I'll be doing is relevant.
Great. So let's take audience questions. So folks could use the raise hand function. I will keep track of questions in that way. Okay, I see Joanne first.
Cool. I guess the first thing I wanted to say is that I thought the paper was very interesting, and the division between ministers and provincial governors, it's useful in that in one case you have this binding constraint of the power sharing agreement, and the other one you do not, and I think there's a lot of, I think there's different, right now you have the basis, I think, for a paper. You can do, and you can do several things. I think that the comments by Tim and Alex were fantastic. Some of the best I've heard at an APCG colloquium, and they're generally quite high in quality. So I know from experience of getting great feedback. But I think there's different things, I guess, you can do with the paper. One option is to make it a broadly policized paper beyond Burundi and Africa in general, in that it's true constitutionalism is practiced, especially elsewhere. Another one is that I thought, in that case, Alex's point was really good, is that you have a lot of references, but your argument is buried a little bit. And then you have rich data that I think you could do a lot more, especially if you want to publish it as opposed to a top-tier African Studies journal into a top-tier policy journal. Even there's quantitative bias, whether we like it or not, right? And so I had a couple of thoughts. Let me go to your paper that may be useful. Shoot, one sec. Oh, sorry. I think I closed the PDF by mistake. Oh no, I got it. Okay, actually, I'll shut up there for a sec, because I closed the PDF when I finished the paper yesterday, and then can I jump again later with a more specific feedback that I had in mind?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So let's take a couple of questions, Réginas, then if you want to reply, we can do that kind of en masse. So Emily.
Hi. So first of all, I just wanted to say this is a really great kind of first like overall attempt at this paper. I think it has a lot to do, or it will like really, as everyone has said, you have so much rich data. So I think that's important to really highlight, and it does feel like it's buried quite significantly in terms of how you can really like strengthen each aspect of it. I will say to my dissertation, which I'm defending soon enough, is on education and the implications of power sharing in Burundi. So I was less shocked that the education ministry was so high standing compared to some of the others, given that it took me forever to get in touch with the Minister of Education, but not so much other people while I was there. So it is important, and it's quite shocking, actually. The one thing I would say as well, if you do go to the more poli-sci aspect of things, you get sometimes a little bit lost in the details of the specific provinces and where they are. And this has come up in my work quite a bit in some of the papers, where it's really hard to figure out which provinces belong in which category and how they've shifted over time. And especially, as Timothy said, like going back and forth, like with Gitega being the center of power before, and then going down to Burundi or Buri and then back, you've got to, what I'm saying is you either need a map or a table to highlight where those provinces are at which time, especially even post Arusha and post-war, how those provinces have changed as well could be helpful just for seeing where these ministers are coming from, and especially in light of the kind of inter-Hutu dynamics, I think would be important. I'll leave it at that and let others.
Okay, great. So let's go to Alicia.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for a fantastic paper and these amazing comments. I'll be very brief, and more I just want to kind of follow up on something Alex said. And I think you potentially have and Emily kind of touched on this as well, but I think you have a potentially really interesting paper buried in here, which maybe just to think about for the future, which is about the salience of those ministerial positions. And I think, you could really draw on some of the fantastic data that you have, as well as potentially make it kind of comparative. I think you have a ton of data, as everyone else has highlighted, and very interesting. And so thinking about how you might highlight some of these for future papers could be really interesting, because I do think that that's a really interesting kind of piece of the puzzle, and conceptually could lead to an interesting paper, very much based in Burundi, but potentially a comparative paper elsewhere. Is like, why is, health, education, these other, ministerial positions that we maybe wouldn't expect to be quite as high salience, why are they, and do we see that in other contexts as well? So I'll leave it there, but thank you so much for a really interesting paper.
Okay, we're going to take just one more comment, and then Réginas, you can respond if you'd like. So Joanne?
Yeah, cool, thanks. Okay, so I have the paper in front of me. And what I'll do is I'll email you the paper, Réginas, after meeting.
Okay.
I
Thank you so much.
The paper, but a couple of things that may be useful to share more broadly, perhaps. I'm going to emphasize some suggestions you could do on the quantitative front to complement the advice you've gotten so far. Reading your argument that discusses critical junctures, I thought that you would present perhaps a year-by-year analysis showing that maybe in the first year of each presidency, we have a sharp break with the last year, say, of the previous presidency, especially when it's a change of actual presidents. That would be first to second, second to third, maybe less, right? Third to fourth, and fourth to fifth. So then at the very basic level, if your theory, if your idea is right, that critical junctures reshape and there's some break in there, you you may find that there's sort of a statistical differences into which groups get what portfolios, right now, because you group the percentages by presidency. You cannot exploit, in fact, a lot of your rich data. So you want to, in short, unpack table 3, it seems to me. Then another thing that I was thinking is, it's true that we have some evidence. You mentioned, I think, this paper by Kremen and Posner and others on how particular ministers, and there's a recent work, an interesting working paper on Benin and so on. And I've done some of that at the more macro level of showing how ministers disproportionately favor their home region. So you wouldn't necessarily be the first to do that, but if you can do that with some local level variable that proxies the provision of some public goods, or people have used, the now famous nightlights data because it's disaggregated and so on, then you could tie the paper to those interested in development and not just in executive/cabinet politics. And if education is so important in Burundi, then maybe we see disproportionate investment in education in the in the region where the Minister of Education comes from. Maybe something similar for infrastructure. Or if we don't, then that's interesting as well, because then, of course, the question is, maybe there's a lot of patronage at stake, much more than biased allocation of public goods. So I think whichever answer you get, it would tell us something that would connect the politics to the welfare implications of how cabinet level positions are distributed, in short. So I don't know what I don't know much about Burundi in short, so I don't know what data is available there. But I think, in short, if you actually make, and maybe there's more to this than we can say in a couple of minutes in a seminar, but you can unpack and use the data really to your advantage. Say georeference it and match it with the nightlights data. You can expand the analysis on 2 fronts, unpacking your own cabinet data, and then link it to maybe a couple of development outcomes. And that would bring the paper, I think, for the standard, applied person who does political economy of Africa, would bring the paper to a whole new level. But I'm happy to discuss later if you want more detail on, I guess, what I have in mind. So, but these are the big picture thing that I think would bring the paper 1 or 2 levels up.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So we'll pause there. If you want to make any responses, Réginas, or if you want to just collect more comments so that we can kind of maximize the time, it's up to you.
No, I think most of the comments that have been made, I think there are suggestions on how I can improve my paper, and I think they are right. So maybe we can go on with other feedback and comments.
Great. All right, Lindsay.
Thank you for sharing this. I agree that a lot of these comments have been so helpful, and I hadn't even thought of some of these great solutions and ideas. But the one thing I feel like we haven't necessarily talked about in the paper is the role of the provincial governorship. We focus so much on the cabinet ministers and their relative salience, which I agree is like an incredibly interesting part, and I think should be the main focus of the paper. But I want to know and maybe this will get worked out in the theory, but what adding in the governors kind of tells us, and what kind of leverage can be gained from that. Understanding that, of course, they're not mandated is very interesting, but to me, it looks like they have almost the exact same results, and that isn't necessarily drawn out or explicated as much as it could be. And in that way, it kind of seems a little bit like it's tacked onto the end of the paper, and like maybe could be better explained and better brought out to the front. And related to that, my other question would be why the first administration in the 2001 to 2003 didn't assign more people to his own ethnic group. And that kind of raises a question for me of whether or not there was maybe more attention being paid earlier on that could explain that. But that I think that could just be kind of brought out and explained more. And I'd like to see that either made more clear what role that brings in the paper, or maybe excluded and put in something different. And then I think it would also be interesting, and maybe this would help compare it more clearly to the salience of the cabinet ministers. But if there is a way kind of measure the relative importance of the various provincial governors, and that might get to the comment about night lights and the relative economic importance of some of these regions. But I think there are a number of ways to do that, and you of course know best, but I just would like to push you to draw that out a little bit more if that's going to be in the paper. So.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Miriam?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so glad I found out about this, this colloquium. Your paper, I thought it was really good. I had one question. And I know because there's also gender quotas within the Arusha, within the Constitution. And I'm wondering if you think, and I believe that the 30% women's quota applies to ministerial to the cabinet, if I'm not wrong. And so I'm wondering how, if that impacted, like, because obviously that's a consideration in assigning cabinet portfolios. So I'm wondering if you think that, I think it probably deserves a mention within the paper, whether or not you think it's relevant or not in how the portfolios were divvied up according to ethnicity.
Great. Rosine?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you, Réginas, for this very nice presentation, also to the discussant, because it is really a very interesting topic. Réginas, I really see the great potential of your paper, and I really hope it will get up to publication, because we really need such kind of studies from Burundians. My contribution is really to ask you, because when you talk about power sharing, when you look at how it came up, like, yeah, it was really embedded in the peace agreement in 2000. And also I wanted to ask you, like, is it possible to say something in your paper about how, like, how the presidents that followed, but we know that Nkurunziza was occupied most of the time since yeah, of the period you're studying, but how the interpretation or his view on this power sharing has also influenced not only the distribution of authority or of positions within the government, like you focus on ministries and governors' position, but I also want to ask if you had some data, or you also observe, or you can say something, because beyond the ministries, we know that in Burundi since 2005, for instance, we have had extra or super institutions, if I can say that like that, at the level of, for instance, in the terms of when it comes to land redistribution, land conflict resolution. We have seen the CNTB, we have seen the CSTB. CNTB is like this National Land Commission in charge of resolving all the disputes of returnees and internally displaced, but and also the creation of the Cour Special, the special court for land and other assets, because these two institutions and have really came up as with specific powers. They are considered as government bodies, and their authority just comes from the presidency and from the president himself. So also within those two institutions that have had a great influence on the life of Burundians, also on the life of ministers and governors. I think it will also be interesting for you to show how the distribution of like this power sharing has been implemented there, how it has evolved also since, let's say, even since the creation of the commission before the CNTB, you know, the commission that was created just in 2003. So it will be really interesting. I think it will also provide some kind of more tangible information, also impact of how the evolution or the dynamics of shifting positions, withdrawing position from minister, or even influencing the role of minister or of governors is really related to key issues in the country, talking about land disputes. So, and I know you might have this data, or you might have access to it. So this is my contribution. Thank you.
Okay, great. Do you want to make any comments, Réginas?
Yes. I think I would like first to comment on Lindsay's comment, actually, because I think she was asking to what extent provincial governor positions are really important, because I think to some extent, because, you know, Burundi being a country which is confronted with a scarcity of resources, you know, getting a political position it's always interesting per se, because I think when someone is interested in what it means to be an authority in Burundi, it's not just about status or salary, it's beyond that, because the way of getting resources goes beyond the institutional or the state capacity, financial capacities. And for these particular positions, I think, well, I was surprised. It's because from the very beginning of the implementation of the power sharing agreement for provincial governor positions, we see that the ruling ethnic group will have most of those positions. And I think it's because those are the positions that are allocated to people who are involved in mobilizing for the ruling party, or the political party that is ruling. And that's why it becomes interesting. Second, as I've seen, it's provinces, they don't have their own resources. Actually, they receive some fundings from the central state. So it's not really, financially speaking, an interesting position, but still it remains important because they have influence on the micro politics that takes place at the provincial level. So that's why it's important. She asked about 2001 and 2003, which is a period that I consider as the equilibrium, the equilibrium time, because it's just the first government that was put in place. And it really reflected the power balance that existed at that time, because it was just after the power sharing agreement. And second is the time where international actors were really involved in the monitoring of the process, because they said, you know, we need to protect this newborn baby, because unless the country will be confronted to political unrest again, and that's why it was an important time. Mariam also asked a question relating to gender, how gender might have influenced the dynamics of power sharing. I think because in the context of Burundi, I think gender and ethnicity, they are not mutually exclusive. So I think that didn't per se affect the power sharing dynamics, but I am also interested in how in which kind of ministerial portfolio are allocated to women with time being, and how it has been evolving, which ministries they are allocated to. All those questions, I think I have another paper that I'm working on, which really deals with the gender aspects. And Rosine now, her comments. Thank you again, Rosine. I think if I knew that you were here when Timothy was asking if ethnicity always matters today, I think I would have recommended your papers, how you showed how the way land issues are being managed for years, how really ethnicity remains something that is really important. So thank you again for drawing my attention on that aspect, on how I think how power sharing unfolds goes beyond the state institutions sometimes, but you can see that there are some strategies that are put in place to circumvent the power sharing spirit or philosophy, if I would say so. For instance, if you see when it comes to managing land issues, how the reforms have been taking place, how, for instance, land issues are no longer dealt in normal judiciary, but that it has been created special court, because of course in the judiciary also there are quota that are applied, and Nkurunziza, for instance, have been lamenting that the judiciary is not cooperating, that it's not really implementing the will of the executive. So I think there is a lot of things to be said on that issue. And for the great part of the time frame that is covered by my research is Nkurunziza presidencies, 3 presidencies actually, and how the way he thought about power sharing has influenced the cabinet management. I think Nkurunziza also changed his ideas and convictions over time, because if you remember when he came to power in 2005, he was opposed to ethnic power sharing, because he said, you know, we need a kind of national polity, not fragmented one, because we are Burundians, we are not necessarily Hutu and Tutsi. So he was opposing that, and the signals that he was sending was like, ethnicity was not that much important, and people believed him, how he allocated important ministerial portfolio. Also, you can, during the first 2 years, you can see that he really believed that either Tutsi or Hutu, it doesn't matter. What really matters is what you are bringing to the country. But starting by 2007, when the FNL was legalized as a political party, then came in the intra-ethnic competition, because FNL was also a Hutu party, and like the CNDD-FDD. So I think that's how radicalization took place, as I would say maybe outbidding strategy, or yeah, because there was an intra-party competition. So I think that's what I would say about how Nkurunziza thoughts or convictions influenced how the power sharing unfolded.
Tim?
Yeah, so one thing I think would be interesting is the salience of ethnicity or gender or any other issue is not a binary, right? It's not either it matters or it doesn't. And it would be interesting if you could think of a way to measure its salience. Because like, I'm not suggesting ethnicity doesn't matter at all anymore, but the question is, has it become less, is it less something that people are going to fight and die over than it was 20 years ago? And if that's the case, then that matters. And so the question is, where the things that you're talking about, where do they move the dial, right? Are they, which direction are they pushing things? And I think you're suggesting that they actually are helping to reinforce the salience of ethnicity. And so finding a way to measure that, and I have no idea how you would do that, would be interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, Rosine.
Yeah, to follow up on what Timothy just said, Réginas, a way maybe to bring some reflections on that, on how, in what direction, or like how ethnicity is really becoming more important at higher level politics at the national level. Maybe you can, because what we are observing since the change of president is also very important. And you have a new narrative, a new discourse that is being promoted by the new president. And I will take the example of this new instruction to record the ethnicity of people on national documentation. It is something that can say something about it can really contribute, to see, okay, after Nkurunziza, what has happened? Because you're also looking at critical juncture, and one critical juncture is also the end of the Nkurunziza and the transition to a new leader still within the CNDD, but with a different mindset. So when you observe what is going on in Burundi over the past 2 years, there are a lot of things that can really give you an idea of how ethnicity, or how ethnic, it's really interrelated with politics, and there's a new discourse that is coming up, but at the same time you have a new way of control, new methods from the top to the lower, to the local level.
All right. Are there any other questions? Or Réginas, do you want to have the final word?
No, if I would say a final word is to thank you again, because it's really impressive, all the input, insight that you are giving. It's really nice to have this opportunity, and
Oh, Joan has one question.
I'll be brief. I don't know if it's maybe a comment in general, but given this discussion on ethnicity, made me think, well, it's not always easy how to measure it, but in some sense, you could, I don't think papers need to necessarily pick a fight to be great papers, although some people think that, but in your case, you are making a case without necessarily providing a lot of evidence to back it up. I have to say that ethnicity remains central and so on. And of course, I think, Tim was saying maybe not to the same extent as it once was, but if you back up that claim, then one option is to say, well, people have been emphasizing other cleavages or other dimensions. Maybe they're wrong, at least for Burundi. And so, in some of my work, I've emphasized human capital considerations in cabinet formation beyond ethnicity. So, you can essentially say, oh, what people like you are saying doesn't apply much to Burundi. And I don't know the real answer, but given your paper, that would be my suspicion. And so in some sense then, without necessarily, you don't have to use, of course, any, really intense language, but it would help situate your paper within the broader debate beyond saying ethnicity matters, right? As opposed to, or in addition to, that's the part that right now is missing. And so that's kind of a framing comment, but it can come in handy when some people want to say, okay, so what's the value of your paper compared to what we already know that, ethnicity matters? And so, well, some people may argue that in some other countries, ethnicity matters less than it used to, or, say Senegal, Tanzania is not even a primary cleavage of political competition. So right? That's somewhat the opposite of what you're saying. So that may be useful as a framing comment.
And it could be things like land distribution, like Rosine was saying, or distribution of civil service jobs, or there could be lots of different points of evidence you could find.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everyone for the feedback and for Réginas for sharing his paper. I hope that this will push your paper in a great direction.
Yes.
And looking forward to the next APCG, which will be next month. You'll see us tweet about it. But thanks again, and congratulations, Réginas, on this great work.
And thanks, Justine, for organizing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.